YouTube channel. So World War One, as we come to the 110th anniversary of the war, right, is a war that I think in the last, probably in the last 15 years or so, has really gotten a lot of attention. Not only did we celebrate the centenary of it 10 years ago, and now we are in the 110th anniversary of its beginning coming this June. But I also think for a lot of people, it is this sort of momentous occasion of technology, and sort of struggles that come out of that. But also, like, we have a lot of people who wrote stories and poems and other things from the war that we remember today. So I want to so we will be looking at those today, and I think that is part of it. I mean, for anybody who has seen the movies about the First World War in the last couple of years, right? This is going to be part of what whether it was 1917 or All Quiet on the Western Front or any of the other movies that um, came out about World War One in the last number of years. You will know that. So let us begin with that this evening. So World War One is a war that goes on that begins in June of 1914 and concludes with the fighting in November of 1918. So it's a war that lasts roughly 4.5 years. But then the conclusion of the war officially does not come until the signing of the treaties in June of 1919. And we're going to spend time at the end of this week's class and certainly the beginning of next week's class talking about that treaty that ends the war and the implications of that. Because we are getting to the point of history now in our studies together where we will have um, where we will a lot of a lot of the topics that we will be discussing are going to be topics that many people might be familiar with, right? World War One, World War Two, the rise of fascism, Hitler and Mussolini, um, and other items as well. So I'm sharing the link to the slides with you currently. So we are going to be discussing World War One today, and then fascism and the emergence of World War Two next week. So I want to begin by asking a question for people to respond to, and that is this. When you were in high school or junior high, did you any many of you may have been taught an acronym or a mnemonic device to help you remember the causes of the First World War. Can anybody remind us that mnemonic device or um, mnemonic device or that acronym to help us remember the name of the causes of the war were? Okay, so you may have heard of the acronym MAIN or MANIA. MAIN or MANIA. So that word "main" stands for M, militarism, A, alliances, N, nationalism, I, imperialism, and then A finally again is the assassination, and we'll talk about each of those in turn. So I want to just start by looking at what Europe looked like on the verge of World War One. So World War One, the fighting and the declarations of war start in August of 1914. So this is what the map of Europe looked like on the verge of the war starting. If we take the dark colored countries on this map first, right? These are going to be the major combatants on what we will call the Central Power side of the war. Germany, Germany is here, right, and predominating in a huge portion of Central Europe, right? Germany, you will remember, is only unified in 1871. So by 1914, Germany is only a 40 some odd year old country. So it's a country that is newly on the map. We know that they are a crucial player in the imperialism movement of the late 1800s. So we know that they are ambitious, they're on the rise, and they are a huge power player, not just in Central Europe, but in Europe more generally. You've got Austria-Hungary, although maybe a smaller member of the European, you know, league, if you will. Austria-Hungary is important because if nothing else, it is acting as a sort of constant what nudge, if I guess would be the technical term, to the rest of Europe, right? It is, it is part of these big meetings and asking for and demanding items. It is part of these, it is part of those imperialist desires. So again, it may not be the largest member or the most important member of the European League, but it is part of all the conversations. And the sort of final member here is the Ottoman Empire. Now, many of us, and I certainly did for a long time, and do often think about the Ottoman Empire as an Asian power or a Middle Eastern power. But it's important for us to be aware that a small portion of the Ottoman Empire is here in far southeastern Europe. So because of that, we do consider the Ottoman Empire a European power. Now, the Ottoman Empire, right, is dwindling in significance at the time. Its power is diminishing rapidly. So that will become and that will play a huge portion of what we are going to discuss in terms of the Ottoman Empire. The colors that are the countries that are not pictured in dark black or gray, um, that will become crucial on the Allied side are the United Kingdom, Great Britain, France, Russia, and Italy. These four powers, right, will obviously win the war, and I guess I'm spoiling something here, sort of jumping to the conclusion. But it's important for us to be aware that those allied powers are going to win, and part of the reason they're going to win is just the sheer size of their domination. If we look at a place like Britain, where you have Britain by this point in 1914 has the largest empire in the world, right? It's not just Canada and the Caribbean in the Western Hemisphere. It's Australia, New Zealand, it's India, it's South Africa, it's Kenya, it's Egypt. France has a giant empire, right, in Southeast Asia, in places like Vietnam, Laos, what would today be Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. It has parts of Africa, like North Africa, like excuse me, like Algeria, um, and far Western Africa. Italy, yes, to a lesser extent, has colonies. They have Libya, but again, they're there, and also Russia. Russia is huge. It is a country that stretches from here in Poland all the way across to the Korean Peninsula. So it's important for us to be aware that Russia just has manpower that they are going to be able to continuously throw at the war, and that'll play crucially into our conversation about the Russian Revolution at the end of this evening's class. So, and that's kind of what I have here in these different slides about the different empires in the early 1900s. So I want to now turn our attention to the main causes of World War One, looking at militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. One last time, just before we get started here, if you could please turn on your cameras would just be helpful not to feel like I'm talking to myself in my basement. So let's talk about militarism. Militarism, a lot of these ideas are going to be best represented in sort of two ways. So I'm going to try my best to talk about them in two different and distinct ways. First, militarism is dealing with this idea of having bigger, stronger, and more powerful militaries. One of the things that I promised you a number of weeks ago was that every time we talked, I would probably start a conversation or start a segment of the class by saying a statement similar to, because we are in the industrial age. And tonight is no different. Because we are in the industrial age, one of the things that is changing here in the early 20th century is this growing attention to how to best and most efficiently conduct war. So a lot of these um, European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and everyone else are and not and non-European powers, I should also add, right? Places like Japan are going to be part are going to be growing their militaristic might in the early 20th century. And I have a chart here that shows us in sort of a monetary perspective how much more money is being spent on military. So if you look at this chart for a moment, please, if you look at a place like Germany, again, Germany, in 1890, in the first data point here, Germany is an only what 18-year-old country. It is a newly industrialized nation. So because of that, you know, it potentially could not supply as much money as other places, France or Britain or Russia. But by the time you get to 1914, 24 years later, Germany is nearly quadrupling the amount of money that it is putting into military. The British Empire more than doubles the amount of money that they're putting into their military. Japan quadruples. Again, I mentioned a number of weeks ago that Japan is a newly industrializing country, and it only starts its industrialization process in 1868. So it's important for us to be aware here that, um, again, Japan, just like other parts of Europe, are new to the game. France doesn't double, but what, 1.5, a little bit more than 1.5 it. Russia triples its production, and even the United States, right? The United States sort of famously isolationist in the early 1900s, excuse me, is getting into the game here by getting into the game here by increasing its militaristic production by nearly 5 times. So what you're seeing here is a huge ramp up of military production. And again, that is just a broader symbol of this growing industrial war process that is occurring, right? I mean, not to make this a facetious point or anything, but like if you were a general or a country waging war in the 19th century, if in the American Civil War, if your soldiers were going into battle, to supply them, you might buy a single shot rifle, you might buy them a uniform, you might buy them a bayonet, and then you might, if for your officers, maybe you buy them a horse. So all in, maybe you're spending, I'm making this up, like $200 on a soldier to supply them. But now we are in World War One. We are technological, we are innovative, there are new tools of war. There are tanks, there are machine guns, there are grenades, there is poisonous gas. So outfitting a soldier becomes inherently more expensive in World War One than it had been previously. And I hope that makes sense, right? So it's important for us to be aware that there are new tools to the trade. I mean, just thinking of it even more specifically, World War One starts in 1914. Kitty Hawk and the Wright brothers, developed the airplane in 1903. We are only 11 years removed from from the quote unquote invention of the airplane. And now by World War One, we are bolting machine guns to the tops of airplanes to shoot from the sky. The Ford Model T and its mass assembly line production was put up released in 1908. We're only 6 years removed from that, but now we are bolting machine guns to the tops of uh, cars, automobiles, in order to better execute the war. So I guess my point that I'm trying to make to you here is that new technologies have emerged, and these new technologies have made it such that it is A, more expensive to conduct that war, but also B, the tools to of the tools of death, if you will, are far more expansive. So that's one aspect of militarism. Another aspect of militarism, and this kind of is what I'm talking about here as that second point, is that it is a symbol of national prestige. Every once in a while, it was believed in Europe, war was necessary. Every once in a while, you needed a war to get the tension out. It defined who was us and who was them. We've talked about that before, but it also gave border tensions, access to resources. Those things emerged in Europe, and people now could sort of have a little war. Some people died, tensions were relieved, and now we could go back into peacetime. So war was seen as a good thing. War was seen as part of life. And every decade and a half, there was a war. So that is your militarism. A, alliances. The late 1800s the late 1800s saw political changes throughout Europe that would draw countries into alliances. What I mean by that is this. I've already mentioned once this evening, and what we already discussed this semester, that Germany and Italy unite their their many different kingdoms and principalities and all that into into countries in the late 1800s. Germany officially in 1871, Italy, depending on how you look at it, either 1861 or 1871. Those alliances create instability, and they're going to create a necessity for either side to try and protect themselves against larger geopolitical or European specific warfare. So if you look at a place like Germany, Germany is newly unified in 1871. It is going to get into the imperialism game. We know that already from a couple of weeks ago. And when Germany is going to go to war, or when Germany unifies, and it sort of thinks again, well, war is inevitable, war is going to happen. Then the German government is going to look for a way to protect itself. So as early as the late 1870s, the German government is going to look for an ally, and it finds that ally in Austria-Hungary and Italy. So that by the late 1880s, Germany has this pretty strong alliance, a protective alliance with Italy and Austria-Hungary. Now, if you look, right, Germany in the center of Europe, Austria-Hungary in the center of Europe, Italy in the center of Europe, right? If you are those red states here, Britain, France, and Russia, you are going to be concerned about this powerful bloc in the middle. So in response to the Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy alliance, France and Russia joined together in the 1880s for their own alliance, um, known as the Entente Cordiale. Britain is added in 1907 to this, creating the Triple Entente. So this alliance is something that begins in response to Germany in the 1880s, and then grows to include Britain shortly thereafter. And the question that I have at the bottom of the slide here, right, is how could these alliances cause problems? And I think you can see that, right? If when Europe goes to war, or when anything happens that will cause Europe to go to war, in the 1800s or the 1900s, these protective alliances are going to coalesce. That'll cause a problem. All right, so we've looked at militarism, we looked at alliances. Now let's look at the imperialistic problems. There's not too much to really say here, other than the idea that Europe has developed major imperialistic and major empires across across the world by the early 1900s, right? So if you look at the map that I have here, if you look at a place like Britain, I've already mentioned Britain this evening, but if you look, Britain not only has its colony here, or sorry, its country here in Europe, but it has Canada, it has parts of the Caribbean, it has pretty much all of East Africa, it has parts in the Middle East, it has India, well, I should say the Indian subcontinent. It has what today would be Pakistan, a portion of Afghanistan, what today is Bangladesh, has Australia and New Zealand. If you look at a place like France, which is this royal blue color, France has obviously itself, it has a portion in the Caribbean, then it also has Northwest Africa, and as I said before, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Just look at the size of the Russian Empire. You have Italy with territories here in Northern Africa and colonies here like Somalia and others. You've got Belgium with a territory in the center. We've talked about the Belgian Congo and the rubber plants. Portugal is involved. So you can see that the size of these empires are massive, and they are important to these sort of geopolitical decisions, right? Very good. So when you look at these different, when you look at the size of these these empires in the late 1800s and early 1900s, right? You might ask yourself, why is this a problem? And the reason that these are problems are kind of two ways. One is rivalry. One of the things about these colonies is that European countries are going to demand more and more resources out of these colonies. And as a result of that, what's going to occur, what is going to occur is huge competition, right? Who can extract the most resources? How quickly can we extract the most resources? And that's going to push and push and push these European powers into greater and greater competition, not just within their colonies, but also within Europe. There's also new experimentation, right? Again, we are in the industrial age. So not only are they producing these war materials in Europe and using them in Europe, but they're also practicing with them in colonies. So again, it's sort of it's building on these larger themes that have emerged. Finally, the last big cause is nationalism. There's in there's what I would think of as sort of two ways. There are two ways to view nationalism. I often describe this as nationalism from above and nationalism from below. We've talked about the word nation before, but I want to just reiterate what a nation is. A nation is a group of people with a common history, tradition, culture, language, in some cases, religion, if that's an identifying feature. And this idea of nationalism, right, is that that passion for those groups of people. So in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, there's this growing sense of nationalism. We already talked about that in connection to German and Italian unification a number of weeks ago. So we know that nationalism is already trending upwards across Europe, but there's two parts of it, from above and from below. I want to start with above, from the above side here. So this map is probably helpful in that respect. So if we look here at this map, right? If I am a British nationalist living here in the United Kingdom and I looked across the globe, I might be excited to think to myself, well, the British are the greatest nation in the world, and we control from the tip of South Africa to the tip of North Africa and Egypt, across to India and across to Australia. We are the best country in the world, and we have control over uh, um, we control so much territory. We are the best, and we must continue to expand our control. And then, if I'm French, I think the same thing. We French control all of this. We must continue to expand our control. So again, that goes back to the competition piece, but that also goes to this idea of the above, right? If I am a British nationalist, I want us to gobble up and hold on to as much of the world as possible. To fight 180 degrees away from that would be other parts of the world. If I am from down here in South Africa, if I live in South Africa here and my leader is up here in London, I have no connect. I may never have been to England. I may not know anybody who has ever been to England or born in England. So why am I part of this larger empire? Or even differently, right? If I even more sort of a close to home situation. If I live, if this is the German Empire here, you know, and they control portions of East Africa, you know, they're German. They don't look like they're African. They don't look like me. They don't sound like me. They don't do any of that stuff. I am not going to have a desire to be part of that empire. So when I talk about nationalism from above, one of the things that I mean is that this idea of growing the empire and keeping a strong empire. Nationalism from above is the exact opposite, is the desire to break up these large empires. So it's important for us to be aware that these are two different opinions and two very much competing situations. So an example of that comes in these two situations. The first is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, which I mentioned a few moments ago, is here in what is today Turkey and the Middle East. And its territory is being broken up by these nationalist movements. Greece receives its independence in 1821. these other parts of Romania and Bulgaria and Serbia and other parts of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Empire and former Ottoman Empire are going to look to break away from the larger territory. There's also this sort of growing idea of pan-Slavism, where these Slavic nations, what would become Yugoslavia, Slovenia, and Bulgaria and parts of Romania, are going to look towards their sort of larger Slavic, connection and desire to be part of them. So there's this growing sort of desire among European powers to have connection to people who sound and look like them. So these are what I often call the long causes of the First World War. These are causes of the First World War that are not associated with a single event. These are things that are just going on in Europe prior to the ultimate outbreak of war in the summer of 1914. So when you were all in junior high or high school, what did you all learn was the spark that caused World War One? Anybody? Daniel, go ahead.
I was about to say what Fiona said, but the assassination of Kaiser Wilhelm.
Not Kaiser Wilhelm, but there is an assassination. There's an assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But you're right. There's an assassination. So on June 28th, 1914, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary. What is an Archduke? The Archduke is the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. So the Archduke of Austria-Hungary is on a diplomatic visit in the city of Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So where is that? So let's just pull my map here. So Archduke Franz Ferdinand is on a trip. He is from Vienna, which is roughly about here. And he is on a trip down here in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is here at the city of Sarajevo. Bosnia-Herzegovina was part of the broader Austro-Hungarian Empire, and a nationalist group from the nation of Serbia, a nationalist group called the Black Hand, orchestrates an assassination on Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So on June 28th, 1914, Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie are in Sarajevo on this diplomatic mission. The Black Hand, with a number of assassins, goes to Sarajevo, and they assassinate the Archduke. Upon his death, not much happens. Yes, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie are both dead, but it's not as if war begins immediately. On the other hand, the ball moves rather slowly. By July 24th, 4 weeks later, Austria-Hungary issues an ultimatum to Serbia. And Austria-Hungary says sort of three parts to the ultimatum. Number one, you must stop talking, have press badly talking about us. Two, you must get rid of officials who are talking negatively about the Austro-Hungarians. And Austria and Serbia agrees to both of those. But then there's a third one. Third piece of the ultimatum is you must turn over those people who are guilty of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And Serbia balks at that. So Serbia does not submit those over. So Austria declares war on Serbia. But prior to doing that, they check with their allies. If you remember back to this map a few moments ago, Germany is Austria-Hungary's ally. Italy is Austria-Hungary's ally. So Germany asks, Austria-Hungary, asks Germany, will you support us if we go to war with Serbia? Germany famously says, Kaiser Wilhelm, who Daniel mentioned a moment ago, and the leadership of Germany says, yes, you have proverbially what we call the blank check. We will help pay for whatever you need. Serbia turns to its ally, Russia, and says, Russia, you will support us if we go to war with Austria-Hungary. Russia looks to its allies, France and the United Kingdom, and they too say that we will support you. So when Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia and Russia comes to the assistance of Serbia, and ultimately France and Britain come to the aid of Serbia and Russia, then war can commence. By August 4th, all of the major combatants of World War I have declared war. The one major exception, or I guess the two major exceptions here, are Italy and the United States. Italy does not get involved until 1915. And when Italy gets involved, Italy switches sides. Italy does not join on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, although they did have an alliance. Instead, Italy joins on the side of the United States, of the United Kingdom, France, and Russia. So they switch sides. Again, by August 4th, 1914, all of the major combatants, with the exception of the United States and Italy, are not involved. So the United States gets involved later. The United States does not officially declare war and get involved until 1917, April of 1917. But prior to the U.S. involvement, the U.S. is involved, and we're not going to talk much about this, but the United States is involved by selling goods, selling boats and guns and tanks and bullets and all that to our allies, the British and the French. So the U.S. has a, let's call it a financial interest in the war prior to this. Okay. So now once wars have been declared, now the fighting needs to begin. Germany is really the first country to make a bold action. So starting in the fall of 1914 into the winter of 1914 to 1915, Germany has what is called the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan is a technology-heavy assault starting in Germany, going across Belgium and the Netherlands and Belgium into northern France, using the Air Force and ground troops to try and knock France out first. And the goal there is then that once France is knocked out and France is done, now Germany could pivot and turn back and focus on Russia. Because as you might be able to tell here, Germany is surrounded by its enemies, right? France and Britain on one side, and Italy ultimately on the south side, while Russia is on the east. We call this a two-front war. Germany that is fighting a two-front war because they have to focus on both sides. They have to fight in the front and in the back, right? They can't put 100% of their attention on either one side. So they have to divide up their forces pretty substantially. What this winds up doing is this means that Germany is going to be struggling to try and get its bearings right away because it has to look in both directions. But it also means that um, both sides are going to be looking pretty ambitiously at how to respond to these actions. Okay, so we've been going. Thank you. Alrighty, so you should see my slides here on trench warfare. So now that we've talked about the long causes and the immediate cause of World War One in the summer of 1914, let's talk a little bit now about the conduct of war. So World War One is really the first really technological war. As I said a few moments ago, we are only what 11 years after Kitty Hawk and the airplane. We are only 6 years from the Ford Model T and the sort of increased car production of the early 20th century. So as the first technological war, right, there's a lot of changes going on militarily, machine guns and how do you defend against a tank and things like that. So when war begins, the generals that are fighting the war or leading the war, I guess I should say, in 1914, right? Many of them had started fighting, in the 1800s, in the 1880s, when machine guns weren't really a thing. Tanks certainly were not, and all of that. So, the type of warfare being conducted, like General Pershing from the United States, right? He started fighting, out in the middle of the country, in the Midwest and in the plains. He was not accustomed to this, new technological type of war. So when war breaks out in 1914, soldiers and generals are not prepared for this new type of war, one that is going to be so heavily technological with machine guns and poisonous gases and things like that. So, trench warfare emerges very quickly as a response to that. So trench warfare, right? Trench warfare has been around for hundreds of years, right? It is not new. Excuse me, it is not new for soldiers to dig ditches to fight their battles from. This has been going on for centuries, if not longer. The thing that makes World War One different is the expansive nature of these trenches, the sort of the hundreds of miles, thousands of miles of trenches that are going to emerge throughout this war. If you look at this map here, this map shows you the different trenches, the sort of the front line fighting that goes on, and the trenches stretch from the northeast, from the English Channel all the way down to the German-French border, even down into sort of North Switzerland. You can see that these are, this is where, um, the first trenches were, but then this is the sort of where trenches emerge, or stay, I guess, for the large part of the war. Now, this is a sort of aerial view, if you will, of what the trenches looked like. So the trenches were, so starting from the back here, moving forward, right? The trenches were, between 4 and 6 feet deep, right? So this is, so they would be dug down and they would have these slats of wood coming across to hold them up as a cross section. These would be sort of your area where the commanders would stay. And you'd have multiple lines of trenches, and then presumably, I guess, back this way, there would be more command towards the where the leadership was. Here, this is your front line trench. This is where your soldiers were under the most this was the most dangerous section of the fight, right? You were under sort of constant attack and had to constantly be concerned about your position. This is the most deadly section here, no man's land. No man's land was an area that you wanted to avoid at all costs. This is where, there would be barbed wire to try and trip people up so that if you went over and tried to attack across no man's land, you might get caught and be easily targeted. There might be gas canisters that are thrown out here. This is an area that is extremely deadly. Even more importantly, as you were running across the field, there would be machine guns over here shooting at people. So that this was, again, not only did you have to worry about what was around you, but you had to look about what was across the field. So that's just the trenches in terms of the fighting. But the trenches themselves were also dangerous because they had a lot of times water in them on the bottom. So your feet might be constantly wet, and this could lead to a condition called trench foot. So trench foot was where your foot, because of being constantly wet and the sores that might develop, a person might develop what was called trench foot, which was basically where your foot is rotting off of your body. It was extremely painful, and really the only way to um, hopefully save a person's life was by amputating the foot, which could expose a person to greater amounts of infection. So trench warfare was very dangerous, very deadly, um, and by December of 1914, between the new technology and the fighting that was occurring, and the impact of disease and the trenches, roughly 1.5 million soldiers had died by 4 months into the war. Um, the because of the trenches, the front lines were hardly moving, and this quickly becomes what we call today in what is called a war of attrition. In a war of attrition, the combatants are not looking to conquer the other side. There's no decisive wins. Instead, it's a war of survival. Which side can survive longer? So it's a war in which, again, which side can outlast the other. So I want to pull up a poem here that sort of, I think, does a great job of describing this idea of technology and the war and the impact of it. And then I want to turn our attention to a couple of videos. So a couple of things. Sorry. And a couple of things here. Number one, this poem is written, and I've highlighted it here, and maybe I'll underline it. I've highlighted it here. This poem is written by a guy named Wilfred Owen. So Wilfred, let me just tell you a little bit about him, tell you a little bit about who he represents, and then we'll look at the poem. So Wilfred Owen is a poet. He's a British poet. He joins the war pretty soon after it begins, by the late 1914, early 1915. And he fights the entire duration of the war. He is fairly well educated. He comes from a sort of middle class family in the north of England. And um, he is on the front line in France for much of the war. He's injured at one point. He goes back to Britain to recuperate and convalesce. And then once he is recovered, he is back in the war fighting on the front line in France. So two things. Number one, Wilfred Owen represents this large class of young men, fighters in the war, who are articulate and who are literate and can write about their experience. Owen was a member of a group of young soldiers who wrote poetry and were part of sort of this literary gang in the war. So we have a lot of his poems. We have poems written by other members of his friends. Along with that, so that's sort of who he represents on a small scale. On a larger scale, we would call this a sort of he's part of this lost generation. He's a guy who is talking about his experiences and trying to make sense of the sort of struggles he was enduring. So Wilfred Owen and it represents sort of these two sides. So I also want to point out here that Wilfred Owen dies right before the war ends. He dies a week before the fighting concludes in November of 1918. He dies on November 4th, 1918, just before the war concludes, and his poems were published posthumously. So that's how we have them. So this poem is a great representation of the sort of experience in World War One. So the poem is called Dulce et Decorum Est, and the title comes from the last line here, Dulce et Decorum Est pro patria more, which means sweet and honorable it is to die for one's country. So Wilfred Owen writes this poem about this idea of it being sweet and honorable to die for one's country. And the poem, I think, well, the poem's ironic, right? You'll see that in just a moment. So this poem comes in three portions. The first portion talks about sort of the boringness of the fight. The second one is sort of the excitement of the gas attack, and excitement. I mean sort of the scariness of the attack. And then the third is about this person dying. So I would like to read it to you so that you can see it. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through the sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot, all went lame, all blind. Drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5 9s that dropped behind. So this first portion here, I think, talks about this sort of drudgery, this sort of malaise people were feeling. They're fatigued, they're exhausted, they're experiencing this awful war. And then here comes a change. Quick, gas, quick, boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all of my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. So you have this excitement. Technology is brought in, the gas attack, new technology being dropped on them. And then he says, if in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil's sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer and bitter as the cud, of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zests to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria more. And the last portion there, right, talks about this sort of unglorified death. It's not, the line that I think is most poignant to me is where it says, in all my dreams before my helpless sight, if in some smothering dream you too could pace behind the wagon, we flung him in. The word flung, we didn't place this guy in a We didn't place this person in a wagon. We didn't ceremoniously, drape them in. We flung the person into this in this. So, again, I think it talks about this sort of experience of the war and the struggles that people were enduring. So so I want to now turn our attention. Another piece about World War One that, um, again, sort of comes back to this idea of a modern warfare is this idea of um, not just nationalism, but sort of a threat to your way of life. And I guess that's not necessarily new. That was certainly part of the Civil War and others, right? But this idea again, coming back to this idea of nationalism and this sort of push towards using this idea of a nation and of us versus them to get more people um into the war, right? So the scrap of paper, Prussia's perfidy, so Germany's perfidy, Britain's bond, the Treaty of 1839, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so it just sort of again shows this us versus them, defending the land and defending your people. Britain's the king wants you, God save the king, join your country's army. Who's absent, almost shaming you, right? Is it you? And all of these different aspects again because this is a Europe that has colonies all over the globe. You have this global nature to it. You have um for Britain, this is Britain, the image of the person in the woman in the middle who is holding the trident and the British shield. She is the Roman goddess Britannia, the sort of embodiment of Great Britain. She's holding a trident. So not only is she Queen of the Seas, goddess of the seas, but she's also, defending the seas and this warrior figure. But the part that I like about this poster, right, is excuse me, the images of um the imperial nations on the side, right? Lending a hand. Friends in need are friends indeed. Australia, South Africa, Canada, India, all of these different parts of the British Empire standing there and to provide assistance. You have playing cards. It's a playing card on the one side. It's if you look at it in one direction, it's a German in his helmet, and then you turn it around the other way, it's a pig. So either way you look at it, it's a pig. Even the United States gets involved. Wake up, America! Civilization calls. Every man, woman, and child. So again, you have these aspects of again getting as many people involved as possible. So I just want to, before we sort of get to the conclusion of the war and look at how the conclusion of the war brings about World War II, 20 years later, I want to just look at what brings the United States into the war. As I said at the beginning of class, excuse me, as I said at the beginning of class, the United States is not immediately involved in World War One. America is not one of the major combatants in the summer of 1914. Instead, the U.S., at first at least, is selling and providing weapons to the British and the French. And this is going to get the United States into a bit of trouble, right? So when you were all in junior high or high school, you all may have learned about what causes the U.S. to get involved in World War One, and some of you may have heard about the bombing of a ship called the Lusitania. Has anybody ever heard that before? The Lusitania. You may have heard that. So the Lusitania is a British ship that was bombed in the Atlantic Ocean in April of 1915. And when it is bombed in April of 1915, about 1,000 people die in total. About 100 of them were Americans. And for a lot of people, for a lot of Americans, this was a huge affront, right? The United States was not actively engaged in the war. Why are Americans dying? So for Germany, this frightens them to try and get the United States into that would potentially get the United States into the war. So Germany stops practicing what was called unrestricted submarine warfare. And for about 2 years, Germany does not do that, does not have unrestricted submarine warfare until January of 1917. In Germany of 1917, January, February of 1917, Germany issues what was called the Zimmermann Note. And within the Zimmermann Note, a couple of pledges are made. Number one of the pledges that is made is so the Zimmermann Note is a note between Arthur Zimmermann, who was the foreign minister for the German Empire, and the president of Mexico. In the Zimmermann Note, Arthur Zimmermann says, "Hey, President of Mexico, if you can keep the United States out of World War I and help Germany win, Germany will provide Mexico with land lost in the 19th century to the United States. Mexico will receive back Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California." And once this is intercepted by the British and then released to the Americans, right? This is another thing that sort of super turns the tide of the American opinion to get into World War I, because not only was it an affront to the Americans to have people dying 2 years earlier in an unprovoked attack, but the fact now that Germany is saying the United States that American territory should be turned over to Mexico is super troubling. The final thing that gets the United States into war has nothing to do with the United States or Germany. In February, March 1917, Russia has a revolution. The Russian Revolution of February, March 1917 overthrows the Tsarist system. So the Tsars have been in charge of Russia since the 1600s. Russia has, and we're going to run out of time tonight, but Russia has had many problems politically and economically in the 19th century. So the United States, when the war breaks out in March of 1917, in February, March of 1917, Russia breaks out into a civil war, into a revolution. The Tsar is forced to abdicate, and Russia is forced to begin negotiations with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians as a loser to World War I. So it's important for us to be aware here that Russia fights in World War I for 2.5 years. The side that they are on will ultimately be the winning side because Britain, France, the United States, and Italy will win the war. But Russia actually loses the war. And because Russia is forced to withdraw from World War I, the United States now can say the United States will now enter World War I and say that they are defending democracy. They're fighting alongside their British and their French counterparts to defend World War One. No, sorry, for British to defend democracy and bring war to a conclusion. So ultimately, World War One comes to an end. The fighting comes to an end on November 11th, 1918. On November 11th, 1918, the German government surrenders completely. It is a complete surrender and capitulation in the city of Paris. Britain, France, the United States, and Italy are the major winners. Germany, and Austria-Hungary are the major losers, and the Ottoman Empire too, excuse me. And now peace must be figured out. So the four big decision makers are Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, George Clemenceau from France, the President of France, David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Vittorio Orlando from Italy. These three guys have these four guys have all different objectives to the war and its conclusion. Woodrow Wilson, who's the President of the United States, his major desire is to bring just peace to Europe, not to have any major defeats, not to really punish anybody too much, really just bring peace. Vittorio Orlando of Italy, he wants to protect Italy's northern border from Austria and Germany. So just to get some buffer territory along northern Italy. France and Britain, on the other hand, have much different ambitions. France and Britain have experienced the greatest amount of loss. Most of the fighting on the Western Front has occurred in France. So there's hundreds of miles of French land that has been destroyed. 71% of the men between the ages of 18 and 35 in France are either dead or wounded. So France has lost and suffered a lot during this war. Britain has lost over 1 million soldiers, billions of dollars in war. So Britain is going to demand, and France are going to demand much more than the Americans and the Italians. And these desires are going to be what will motivate and animate these different negotiators when they arrive at Paris in December of 1917. So let's turn. So if you could, actually, I should share this with you all. Okay, so I'm going to share. I didn't share these with you before, so I want to show you. I want to share them with you now. So when World War One comes to a conclusion, this treaty is negotiated. It is ultimately signed in June of 1919. Now, this is the Treaty of Versailles, is the treaty that ends the war between Britain, France, Italy, and the United States, and Germany. There are other treaties that end war with the Ottoman Empire and others. So Germany is forced to surrender its overseas colonies. That's what Clause 119 is. Clause 159 and 181 are the reduction of the military to 100,000 men, reducing the Navy, and so on. But the two biggest clauses that will animate Germany for the next number of years are Clause 231 and Clause 232. Clause 231 is the clause that is known as the War Guilt Clause. Germany was forced to accept blame and culpability for the fighting. So it says The Allied and associated governments affirm and Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and the associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war. So Germany is forced to accept the blame. And then once blame is given, clause 232 are the reparations, the requirement of Germany to pay. In those days, the bill was 40 billion gold marks. In today's money, this would be equivalent to about $33 billion twice over, so up to a total of $66 billion. So a huge sum of money. This will ultimately bankrupt Germany and create the situation where sort of radical ideologies can emerge in Germany in the 1920s. And we'll talk more about that next week. So Germany is punished very, very severely at the end of World War I. Germany is forced to give up, and that's as I said a moment ago, Germany is forced to give up all of its colonies overseas. It's forced to give up territory along its borders. So Germany, again, is really shut down into sort of, just a very, very small amount of territory. All of these things that, Germany's bankruptcy, Germany's needing to give up colonies, Germany's embarrassment because they are forced to take blame for World War I, will lead to the rise of Hitler and the Nazis in the 1920s and into the 1930s. And that'll be our topic next week. So World War I, as this first major technological and innovative war that happens from 1914, with the fighting concluding in 1918, is one that sees the change in how war is conducted and the belief of what war is good for. And this war of attrition is one that sees the death of tens of millions of people, the destruction of hundreds of thousands of miles of land, and will ultimately cue up the political and social structures that will ultimately lead to World War II 2 decades later. So next week we will discuss the rise of radical ideologies as part of World War I and the aftermath of that. We will look at the Russian Revolution and how Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin are able to take over Russia in the 19 teens and 20s. And then we will turn our attention to the rise of Hitler and Mussolini in Germany and Italy, respectively. So have a wonderful week, and I'll see you all next week.
Thank you.